positive reason to support the government security forces. And that's exactly what he did. Essentially, Templer made a deal with the people of Malaya. He said to them, if you, the Malayans, will support us, the British, to put down this communist uprising, we, the British, will grant you, the Malayans, independence. That was a pretty good deal. That was something the people of Malaya wanted. It made sense. And it seems like a no-brainer, and yet at virtually the same time, the French were trying to get their Algerian allies to fight for a continuation of French colonial rule. No wonder they lost. By contrast, this deceptively simple approach that Templer employed, I think, has been responsible for most counterinsurgency successes of recent decades, not only in Malaya, but also in places like El Salvador in the 1980s, Northern Ireland in the 1990s, Iraq during the surge in 2007, 2008, and in Colombia, which is, I think, has been one of the great overlooked counterinsurgency success stories of the last decade. Now, the final point I want to make here is, why does any of this matter? Why should you care about how you fight an insurgency? Well, if you listen to a lot of people in this town, it doesn't matter. We're out of Iraq, we're getting out of Afghanistan, we're pivoting to the Pacific. A lot of folks, including in this building, would like to get back to good old-fashioned conventional soldiering against a mirror image adversary, which I would be totally in favor of, if only we could get our enemies to cooperate. If we had more adversaries as obliging as Saddam Hussein, who would put a big tank army out there in the desert with a big hit me sign on it, that would be awesome. That's exactly the kind of battle at which we specialize. The bad news is our enemies are not entirely imbeciles. They do have a capacity to learn from history, and they understand they're going to get much more mileage out of attacking us using irregular warfare tactics than they are by fighting us out in the open in exactly the kind of war we would prefer. And so, of course, that's exactly what they're doing, as the attack on the Boston Marathon should remind us. Osama bin Laden may be dead, but terrorism has not gone away. In fact, Al-Qaeda itself has spread to new lands like Syria, Libya, and Mali, where it was not present before. And here's the really disquieting thing. Terrorists are actually getting more powerful. This has been one of the disturbing trends of the last century. There is more and more killing power available to the individual. I mean, think about it. A century ago, when Western armies were campaigning against guerrillas, think about our own wars against various Indian tribes on the Great Plains. They were facing adversaries who were typically armed with nothing more than bows and arrows, some spears, maybe a few rifles. Today, of course, there is no corner of the world so remote that every young man doesn't have access to an AK-47, a rocket-propelled grenade, explosives, all of these relatively simple infantry weapons that have nevertheless taken a fearsome toll among American troops over the last decade. And there is no place in the world where somebody can't go online and access a recipe for making a pressure cooker bomb. And far worse may be in the offing. We've already seen insurgent groups like Hezbollah that have tens of thousands of rockets at their disposal. Where does this lead? Well, the ultimate nightmare, of course, is that insurgents can get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. At that point, you could have a terrorist cell of, let's say, 10 or 20 individuals with more killing power than the entire army of a non-nuclear state like Germany or Brazil. That's a pretty terrifying scenario, especially because I'm very much worried that George Clooney may not be there to save the day. What happens if George Clooney is not there in the nick of time? Well, let me leave you with one final slide from a magazine that I'm sure all of you read regularly called the International Journal of Health Geographics. This is from the 2007 issue, if that'll jog your memory. This was a study of what would happen if various sized nuclear devices were set off in various American cities. And I don't want to alarm you unduly, so I'm not showing you what would happen to your hometown. I'm showing you what would happen to my hometown, New York. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, A 20 kiloton device is not that powerful. It's about the same size as the bomb that leveled Nagasaki in 1945. And yet if you look at the impact from this chart, it's pretty clear that unless you live north of Yonkers, you're in deep trouble. In fact, the estimate is it would kill roughly 600,000 people and injure 1.6 million more. That's pretty horrific. I mean, that makes 9/11 look like a Sunday in the park by comparison. Now, I don't mean to unduly alarm all of you or to seem alarmist. I'm not suggesting this is going to happen tomorrow. Knock on wood, it'll never happen. But we have to acknowledge the disturbing possibility that it could happen, especially when you see North Korea testing nuclear weapons, when you see Pakistan growing ever more unstable, when you see Iran getting closer to acquiring its own nuclear weapons. This is not outside the realm of possibility. Rome was brought down by barbarians. Today we face our own barbarians who are infinitely more powerful. The first line of defense, I would argue, is to simply understand the problem, to understand the long history of insurgency and counterinsurgency, and especially not to turn our back on the body of knowledge acquired at such high cost by so many of you over the last decade on how to fight insurgencies. This issue is not going away. In fact, if there's any purpose served by my writing this book, it's really to put together this body of knowledge so that people in the future can consult and understand some of the issues that we will confront in the future, just as we have confronted them in the past and just as we have confronted them today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And I'd love to hear some questions or comments. Oh, and use the microphone, I've been instructed to say.
Boot, Colonel Scott West, I've read your book, several of your books. My point's pretty straightforward. You've contrasted the French and the British approaches. And of course, the United States has been involved in counterinsurgency and stability operations over the last decade. As we enter a budget-constrained environment, and lessons that we've learned from these overseas deployments, the fact that many times it requires a prolonged presence in those countries and requires enduring presence and very difficult challenges in terms of public affairs or public opinion. What would be the best strategy you could recommend in terms of sort of fighting these wars on the cheap as we go into, again, a more budget-constrained environment in the future? And the supposition that with many guerrilla movements that they can outlast us, both Western forces and host nation governments, there's legitimacy problems.
Well, that's a very good question. Fundamentally, I'm not sure it is possible to necessarily fight on the cheap, at least not without a lot of patience. I mean, this is what makes these kinds of wars so challenging, because they are so far from the ideal of conventional war, where the ideal, of course, is something like the Six-Day War. You finish up the war, you defeat the conventional armed forces of the enemy, and you go home to a victory parade. Of course, in these kinds of conflicts, there are no quick or easy victories, and there are seldom any victory parades. The average insurgency in my database since 1945 has lasted almost 10 years. So you do have to have staying power. Now, that doesn't mean that we necessarily have to keep 100,000 or 150,000 or even 60,000 troops in a country for decades to come. It does mean that we have to work on bringing more stability and better governance to a host of countries which are threatened by insurgencies and which are of strategic interest to the United States, and in particular this broad swath of countries from West Africa to Central Asia, where governments tend to be very weak. Many of them have recently been overthrown, and insurgent groups are very strong and operating and trying to take power. And we know that if they do, the results will not be good, because many of these groups will set up, if they can acquire power, they will set up training camps to train a whole cadre of international terrorists, as they did in Afghanistan, as they tried to do recently in northern Mali, and they will do wherever they take power. So I think we have a real stake in trying to prevent that from happening. I mean, you're absolutely right. We're not going to, there's little appetite for sending vast bodies of troops. We can certainly try to help if we can at less cost. But we need to have the right capacities to do that. And I'm not sure we do have the right capacities, because a lot of what it will take are very savvy and smart advisors who really understand the geographic and especially the human terrain on which our adversaries operate. And that's hard to generate in our current system, where all the personnel bureaucracies are designed to rotate people all the time. It's very hard to generate this kind of understanding. I think one of the reasons why the surge in Iraq was pretty successful in 2007, 2008, is simply by that point, we'd been there for 4 years, so we had a lot of people who, for better or for worse, had done multiple deployments and understood something of Iraqi culture, a lot more than we understood, certainly, in 2003. But how many people do we have who understand culture in Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Syria, many other countries which are threatened by insurgencies? Not enough. We need to work on generating that body of expertise, and we need to work on generating the capacity to do better at aiding in state building. Around here in this town, I guess the term nation building is anathema. But in fact, that's what we have to do, because this is not some kind of soft-hearted humanitarian enterprise. This is, in fact, I think, a very hard-headed national security imperative, which is that if we're going to defeat these groups, I don't think we're going to do it simply by taking out their leadership, using drone strikes or anything else. I think drone strikes are a useful mechanism, but they're only one line of operations, which needs to be nested in a much broader counterinsurgency campaign. Fundamentally, insurgencies and counterinsurgencies are really a competition for governance, and we have to be able to provide better governance than our adversaries, or to be exact, to help our allies provide better governance than our adversaries. And so to do that, I think we need to have much more focused state-building capacity in the U.S. government than we have today. So the whole burden doesn't fall on the armed forces, so that we have civilian capacity to undertake these missions. Because if we don't bring some stability and governance to these areas, we're not going to defeat these groups. And attacking their leadership with drones is going to be about as effective as mowing the lawn. It's not a bad thing to do, but it's not going to ultimately solve the problem. So we need to think about the fundamentals, I think, of counterinsurgency, which apply whether they're being applied by 100,000 American troops or by a much smaller force of advisors, as they have been in places like Colombia or the Philippines. Sir?
Hi, I'm Ron Graneri from the OSD Historical Office, and I'm glad at the end there you were talking about the need for governance, because as a historian I was thinking about the examples that you've cited, and something struck me. The difference between Bolivia and Colombia, which are successes, and Algeria or Vietnam, or even Malaya, is Algeria, Vietnam, and Malaya, we're talking in part about a part of an empire. And we're talking about, certainly for Algeria in particular, right? The French might have said, Algérie française et la France, but that doesn't make it true, and it certainly didn't make it true for the people who lived in Algeria. And so what we have is, when you're dealing with an insurgency that is saying there is a foreign force in this country that needs to get out, and an insurgency that's also saying the government is illegitimate because it is allied with that foreign force. That's a little different than when you're talking about a country like Bolivia that has a relatively stable government that might have some advisors but doesn't have a large army in it. And I guess the question that I want to ask when I think about these comparisons, and I don't want to belabor the point, is that really governance is so important that actually trying to fight insurgencies for somebody else by sending large amounts of American troops is historically a bad and dangerous idea.
Well, it certainly can be a dangerous and misguided idea. The problem is, what's the alternative? This is a thesis that Dave Kilcullen, among others, have advanced about how our very presence in these lands creates these so-called accidental guerrillas who are really fighting because we're there and would not otherwise be fighting. And that's true. Certainly that's a phenomenon we've seen, especially in places like Nuristan, remote regions of Afghanistan, where for example, the Taliban are not that strong ideologically. They just don't like outsiders. That's true. But it isn't thereby the case that if we simply withdraw from these lands, everything will work out fine. In fact, we saw in the case of Afghanistan that things didn't work out fine in the 1990s when we had zero presence there. I mean, there was no American presence in Afghanistan to react against in the 1990s because we'd washed our hands of the place. We'd left. We left Afghanistan on their own. And what happened when they were left on their own? As we know, the Taliban and their buddies in Al-Qaeda took over. So yeah, of course, there are dangers of American intervention, that we do the wrong thing, we generate a backlash. I think there's certainly evidence that we did both of those things in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think not so much even because of our very presence there, but just because we were there, we made great promises in the beginning, but we weren't delivering on the promises. We weren't delivering the peace and security that we had vowed. And I think in both places, there was a lot of openness to American forces at first, as I'm sure many of you can testify from personal experience. But when they saw that we weren't bringing peace, we weren't bringing stability, we weren't bringing prosperity, and we weren't really delivering democracy, they turned against us. And at that point, it became a much more dangerous environment. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to bring that up, but, you know, simply standing on the sidelines and saying that if we pull out, everything will work itself out, I don't think that's a viable policy either. I think wherever possible, you know, alluding to the earlier question, it's great if we can go in with a relatively light footprint of advisors, you know, diplomats, aid officials, maybe some special operations forces, a relatively small footprint. I think obviously everybody would prefer that. I mean, we would prefer that, the host nation would probably prefer that. Of course, the difficulty you get into is that's not necessarily something that's possible in a situation like Iraq or Afghanistan after we depose the previous regimes, because, you know, the key to success in places like the Philippines, Bolivia, Colombia, El Salvador, or other places is we're able to work with host nation forces that may not be that effective, but at least they exist and you can build up their effectiveness. But as you know, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, after we deposed the previous dictators, there were no host nation forces. I mean, I have a lot of admiration and respect